Hi, I'm Luke Gustafson, and this is my father, Wayne Gustafson, and I just finished reading his novel entitled Community of Promise, and it's a story of Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness, based on biblical scripture, but it varies quite a bit from the biblical story. How is it different?
Well, my story picks up where the Bible leaves off. One of the features at the end of the biblical story is that Moses is not allowed to go into the Promised Land, and he dies on Mount Nebo. In my book, he has decided that he doesn't want to go into the Promised Land. He could if he wanted to, but he doesn't want to, because he's sure that once the Israelites start setting up their government and first kicking out all the people who are there and killing them, that they're going to forget a lot of the really important things that they learned while they were in the wilderness. So he gets together with a group of like-minded people, and they fake his death on Mount Nebo. The people just think that he died, and he and a small group go back towards the wilderness to look for a way to do a Promised Land a little differently.
Yeah, that was a very interesting idea, that he would possibly have faked his death. How did you come up with that idea for this story?
Well, the faking of the death just came out of the writing, but there was a lot about the meaning of the wilderness that was really important to me. A number of years ago, I started doing a workshop on addiction and spirituality. And it was the kind of workshop where I used the Exodus story as a kind of metaphor for the process of addiction and recovery and relapse prevention. And one of the things that I had learned in my work with addictions was that a lot of people really get the good feeling about life when they're still in treatment. And when they get out of treatment and get back into the world and get sucked back into their old patterns, that sometimes they forget the really important things that they had learned. And so that idea was kind of knocking around in my head for a while. And then one of the things that I do is I'm an interim minister. I'm now in my third church here in New York doing that. And a few years ago, one of my parishioners in another church asked me a question after services one day. He said, why is it that Moses was not allowed to go into the Promised Land? And I thought about it for a minute, and then I heard myself say, well, maybe it wasn't that he couldn't go, maybe it was that he didn't want to, for the reasons that I said earlier, that he just couldn't stand to see them forget those important things that they had learned. And that sort of surprised me. I hadn't really planned that answer, but it just kind of came out. So over the next few months, I was thinking about those two things quite a bit, and this story started to develop in my head. And I was talking to people about it and saying, so what if Moses just decided not to go? What would that have been like? What would have he had done instead? And one day I just sat down and started writing. It just was a story that wanted to be told.
So the title, Community of Promise, how did that come about?
Well, the traditional understanding of the Promised Land is really about geography. That this was a promise of a place to go for this people. And I'm not saying that's wrong. You know, I'm not arguing against that. What I'm saying is that that's not the only way that people can conceptualize what the promise might be. In this particular story, the promise is not about a particular piece of land. And it doesn't require them to say, this is our land because God said so, and now we have to kick everybody else out in order to take it over. The promise came in the form of the relationships that they had in the community, and the fact that they operated according to mutual respect, and they didn't have one prophet of God who was the only conduit to divine wisdom and purpose, but rather they encouraged one another to be in touch with the divine in whatever ways that happened. And it happens in many ways. Some people it happens in their in their thinking process, that they find things coming up that they, like I said, I didn't know some of those things were there in me. That was part of the experience for me. Some people do it through meditation and prayer and have to get into that very quiet place in themselves, and then they kind of see and hear things. Other people do it through dreams. They wake up with dreams, and those dreams mean something to them. Some people do it in their relationships, that they hear somebody else say something to them that has a bigger meaning than just that conversation that's going on. And so in this community, the promise has to do with developing that mutual respect and mutual usefulness of the various ways that people engage the divine.
As we said earlier, this novel presents a different account of these events than the Bible gives, or at best a very radical interpretation of those events. And do you think that your account is more likely to be more accurate than the biblical story?
Well, first of all, I want to take issue with the word radical that you used. I don't think it's a radical point of view. I just think it's a different point of view. I suppose for some people, radical and different are the same thing, but it's not for me. I think life is very complex, and I think relationships that people have with each other and in their communities and their relationships that they have with God, that they express through their religious activities, is also very complex. And that there are so many different ways that people encounter God and learn about God and experience God. I think it's important for people to be able to share that with one another, not in a competitive way. I haven't written any of this with the idea that I'm going to give people the right way of seeing it. It's just another way to look at it. I also believe that when people have mystical experiences, to some degree, how they interpret that is based on what they already believe. And so I take a case where these two brothers have very different kinds of beliefs about what makes the good life and what makes relationship, and so the way they look at Moses' religious experiences, his mystical experiences, is going to be quite different. One looks at it in a very concrete way. He's the older son, and he's kind of the stenographer who writes these things down in a way that implies that this is the only way it can be. The other brother isn't so sure, and he has his own experiences of encounter with what I call the Holy One in the book, and it's not so clear. It's very confusing, and he really needs to work hard to think about what it might mean and how it translates into action. I don't know which of those ways is correct. I just know they're very different, and I know that people who are on religious paths will use those two ways and many other ways to make meaning of their experience.